everyone. Welcome back to the Mind of Cy Marie. Today, we are looking at the roots of resilience and the fragility of our foundations. My guest today has created a richly imagined world that serves as a powerful lens for the tensions shaping our modern world. Peter Gribble is the author of the City of the Magicians trilogy, a story about what happens when intelligence and high ideals meet the gritty reality of a fracturing society. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you here in the studio today. Welcome.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks for having me.
So you've built a society in your books that has many considering it to be kind of a utopia, built on intelligence and pacifism. What was it about the breaking point of such a society that made you want to dive into this specific topic?
It started, I didn't realize it at the time, but it started when I was about 9 years old. I was fortunate enough to live in France for 3.5 years. The nice thing about Europe is that you can get in a car and drive through 5 countries if you like. The second summer, my parents wanted to see the Normandy invasion landings and all that sort of thing. But when we went to school, we were told on the first day it was an international French school for NATO kids and diplomatic corps kids. And we were told there was a war, Germany lost, you do not talk about it. And so, okay, fine. So we had no idea what the war was about at all. So when that summer of when I was 9 years old, I saw all those little white crosses stretching to the horizon. I was absolutely flabbergasted. My mom was trying to exercise my poor little arithmetic skills by asking as we stood in front of each cross, and how old was this one? And they were all dying in the 1940s. And then we went to another cross, and she said, no, how old was this one? And the numbers are wrong. And I raised this to my mom, and she said, aha, that's because he died in the First World War. And I was stunned into silence. There were two world wars, and in the same place? And for what? So when we finally got in the car and got off to the Vimy Ridge Memorial, which was pretty important to Canadians because some thousands were lost in a very short time. I refused to get out of the car because something in me had awakened and said, this is wrong. And I could not have articulated it at that time. But there's a curious sense of knowing that you are right deep down and in tremendous certainty. But it took me decades before I could even consider writing about it. But City Magicians sprang from that experience decades earlier.
That's that must have been quite an experience. I can just imagine being in that place and all that you must have felt. So, the City of Magicians explores how cultures drift into complacency. Why do you think the theme of societal awakening resonates so deeply with readers in today's political climate?
Well, I think for the last several decades, a lot of us have been very comfortable, and comfort breeds complacency. Well, we can keep going the way we have, and then when the changes begin to happen, just we can adjust, and then the adjustments become more and more. They start to add up, and when do you put your foot down and say no? Enough. So everyone's enough line will be different. But in City of Magicians, I have several protagonists. The Sass is being picked as the educator of the barbarians. So how are they going to get the barbarian to not either A, invade or B, destroyed or B, rape and pillage and burn? But they have a strategy. It should work. But the guy that they've chosen to educate the barbarian just says, what? They made a mistake. So, and that's chapter one.
Well, that sounds very intriguing. So, you focused on the social web of this intellectual city. How do you write about culture that is losing its moral clarity without losing hope in the characters themselves?
Well, that's an interesting thing about if you have integrity, soft little challenges to it can either make it susceptible to the complacency or it can strengthen it. And bit by bit, as Sass himself finds that, oh my goodness, I've been compromised. And he has been rather badly. And it was done behind his back and secretly. He wrestles with this. And in the end, he realizes he is a citizen first and foremost, and he has to keep going with the strategy that has been already launched. The other character, Lalia, she gets recruited inadvertently into a secret society that plans to collaborate with the same barbarian. And she thinks, my goodness, okay, I guess I can go along with this. But very quickly she realizes that she can't. So how does she preserve her integrity and yet keep it completely buried? Otherwise, if the secret society that she now belongs to recognizes, no, she's laden with potential treachery. It keeps her alive by keeping it secret.
So, in the trilogy, your characters have to pivot from these high ideals back toward a hard earned strength. Based on your writing, what do you think is the hardest thing for a person or a society to reclaim once it's been lost?
To catch it, good question. To catch it in time, to realize that there's compromise, or compromise doesn't necessarily mean giving up your ideals or your integrity. It can be situational, but as I say, as the situations deteriorate or make more demands, both Sass and Lalia begin to figure out how to maintain it secretly, or in the end, put their foot down and say, "No, I can't go along with this." And then when Sass decides, when he finally faces it with Pooter the barbarian, who they're linked, they're bonded, so they care very deeply for each other, but they have nothing in common, and so that's the wrestle for both sides of that divide. Where Lalia, she has exposed her underground movement, and yet at the same time she becomes the ambassador for it, and so it was a fun experiment for these people to maintain themselves, and yet they find that their hiding places have been compromised, and they have to come out and take a stand. And this is somewhat based on I love reading history, so you can take a look at people who have undergone similar crises, and how do they manage to get through it, or
Yeah, history is something I'm very into, and I love, like, just I can hear all the references throughout what you've been explaining here. The inspiration is pretty awesome from the point in France. But I talk a lot about empowerment and reclaiming empowerment on this show. So, in your world, empowerment looks like awakening. What can modern readers learn from the quiet resilience of those who see the cracks in the wall before everyone else does?
to stay alert, be reverent to your own integrity, keep a stance of openness, generosity, but be sharp, because there are those who will take advantage of it to say, well, if you're going along with this, why can't you get along with that? And to say, well, there are parameters here, there are lines that I will not cross. And as I said before, sometimes a challenge to your integrity makes us stronger. But if you begin to cave, when do you begin to say, wait a second, enough? But the acceleration in going along with things can be very tough to argue against. And where the heck are the brakes? Where do we say no with provisions, or no with a sense of finality? No, this is going too far. And sometimes it can be done gently. And it goes back to that notion of, are we in a transition, or are we in a rupture? And from transition to rupture, there are still gradations. Even if the things are falling apart, what parts can you shore up? It starts with yourself.
So, the road to completing a trilogy is long and often humbling. What was the biggest level up you had to experience as a writer to handle such heavy philosophical themes while keeping the story immersive?
I love that question. I tend to write well to endings, whether they're chapter endings. I like having a little question mark, or a little oops, or a little ratcheting up of the suspense. Or sometimes a character will acknowledge something and realize, oh my goodness, this changes what I have to do now. But it wasn't until I wrote the last chapter of book 3, which was rather soft and amorphic, and it was a very gentle sort of ending that didn't seem to resolve much. And in the end, so once I'd written it out in very soft form, my little inner writing voice said, okay, you've got that under your system. Now write this. And oh my goodness, when the writing grabs you by the throat and throws you to the ground, it's so exciting. I wrote for 10 hours straight with no breaks. It was just, I was on fire. I was incandescent with this brand new ending. And when I showed it to my partner, because he was sort of my first editor, and I was writing for him as well in a different form. And when he saw this, he said, oh my goodness, don't change a word. Nor did I. But it forced a complete revision of everything I'd written to bring it up to the caliber and the power and the strength of that last chapter. It took me 5 years of editing, but it was glorious. That last chapter made me a better writer.
That's awesome. My next question is, if you could give one piece of advice to a society currently feeling those first cracks of fracture, what would that be?
What makes you feel uncomfortable? Whether it's something within yourself or something that someone has said to you? What is, so there's sticking in your craw, as it were. For me, it was that strange experience in the Normandy cemetery with those tens of thousands of crosses, which took decades for me to begin to explore. I have a provisional sympathy for pacifism, and it is provisional because, and I read Martin Luther King's essays and read his speeches, and also Mahatma Gandhi's. Satyagraha. They talk about how you revise your approach to life and you develop habits of pacifism. Watch your thoughts. If you have a violent thought, replace it with something that is more beneficial, reverential, that sort of stuff. But the problem for me was that both of these amazing giants in the history of humanity, they ended up dying violently. So what is wrong with pacifism that invites this type of an end? And if you take a look at, say, British history, the whole pacifist approach delayed the entry of England into World War II. So I think it's start with yourself. What sticks in your throat? What troubles you? What makes you uncomfortable? In my case, it was um, the graveyards in Normandy and the study of pacifism, which has amazing approaches to things. If you take a look by contrast to the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, wow, that was successful and nonviolent. The people turned out, the government fell. But timing was everything. You take a look what happened in Iran, and the people showed up in January, and the IRGC just came down like a ton of bricks. It didn't work that time, but it may be happening later on. So there are additional factors in the equation of how do you resist things that are against humanity and life in general.
So, this series deals heavily with leadership under fire. When the city starts to burn, metaphorically or literally, does the role of does the role of the magician change from a thinker to a doer?
Yes, Sas, in order to bond with the Puru, the barbarian, he begins training in what is called telepathic sendings. Now, the magic involved in the City of Magicians is the magic that you and I experience on a daily basis. I like to use the example of when we're walking down the street and something tells us, oh, cross the street, turn left here. And suddenly you bump into someone, oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in 10 years. Um, but the thing is to step back and take a look at what were those breadcrumbs that I somehow instinctually, unconsciously, or non consciously followed in order for this to happen. Reality or the universe conspires in our favor. And if you follow your own leadership, your own instincts and awareness, it requires some degree of training your own alertness to be cognizant of these things. I like to think of the consciousness, the sentience of reality itself, that we live in this medium of awareness, but we're asleep most of the time. But there are these other underlying aspects of ourselves that can lead us in larger, better directions.
Finally, Peter, if your trilogy were a bridge between the ideals we hold and the reality we live in, what is the one virtue you hope people take with them across that bridge?
It is actually being developed more strongly in books 4, 5, and 6, the second trilogy, but there are seeds of it. It's to develop a reverence for existence. And in that reverence for existence, everything from a stone on the ground to a flower to the person that you're sitting anonymously beside on a bus or um, a metro, you just realize that there's life everywhere. And that is the magic. That is the foundation of the magic. And when we become more conscious observers of this, we realize how we can begin to slide into the slipstream of sentient reality and find everything weirdly, wonderfully, magically falls into place.
That was beautifully put. Peter, thank you for sharing your vision and your craft with me today. It's been an incredible journey into the heart of what makes a culture survive.
Thank you, Simon Marie. Nice to be here. Nice to have met you.
To everyone listening, go get your hands on the City of Magicians trilogy by Peter Gribble. It's obviously a very interesting read just from what he's described to us here. It is a powerful exploration into integrity and renewal. And remember, the mind is the most important story that we'll ever tell. Thank you for listening to The Mind of Cy Marie. All right.